So here we go. Tales of a Grandfather by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 7. The story of Sir William Wallace, 1296 to 1305. I told you that Edward I of England had reduced Scotland almost entirely to the condition of a conquered country. Now, who was it that sold Scotland?
Lord Bailey?
Balliol.
No. Thank you, Rachel. It was John Balliol. He wasn't a lord.
Oh.
He was what was his... Of what? Where was he originally from? Or where was his descendants from?
Norway.
No.
Australia.
They went Normans. Him and also...
Yeah, that's what I went. Yeah, I said Norway, which is technically not.
No, Normans are Northmen, north of France.
Oh, well, I didn't know that.
Right.
You know.
Anyway.
Now I know. At least I can say it.
Good. The English governed it with much rigour. Many persons were called into the courts of justice, fined, deprived of their estates. What does that mean?
And they don't have enough.
Got taken off what?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
They got the lands taken off.
We try and articulate some. Okay, don't just say breadcrumbs and bicycles and one-word answers.
Stop it.
So what?
Stop saying that and just get on with it.
I'm just making sure you understand.
But understand that we can't say
And otherwise-
cars, bicycles and breadcrumbs.
Well, don't just want one-word answers.
Okay.
And otherwise severely punished. Then the English treasurer tormented the Scottish nation by collecting money from them under various pretexts.
What's pretext?
Good question. Various pretexts means like taxes and different measures, different ways of collecting the money. But it can maybe be disguised. So rather than asking for the money totally, they would add it onto another bill.
Oh yeah.
But there's lots of various methods.
So just giving them more money to pay off.
Yes, adding more bills, like putting tax on whiskey or whatever, for example. The Scots were always a poor people, and their native kings had treated them with much kindness and seldom required them to pay any taxes. They were, therefore, extremely enraged at finding themselves obliged to pay to the English treasurer much larger sums of money than their own good kings had ever demanded from them, and they became exceedingly dissatisfied. Besides these modes of oppression, the English soldiers, who had been placed in garrison in different castles of Scotland, thought themselves masters of the country, treated the Scots with great contempt, took from them...
What's contempt?
Contempt, probably not regarding them with any authority.
Who? Regarding who?
The soldiers treated the Scots as if they were just vagabonds. Took from them by main force whatever they had fancy to, and if their owners offered to resist, abused them, beat and wounded, and sometimes killed them. So that's the English soldiers killing the Scottish just for the fun of it. Scotland was, therefore, in great distress, and the inhabitants only wanted some leader to command them, to rise up in a body against the English or Southern men, as they called them. What's the Scottish word for Southern men? What's it? You don't just say you Southerner, you...
Southern.
It's a Scottish word that sometimes...
Vagabond?
No.
Delinquent?
It's a Sassenach. You Sassenach. Just means Southerner. And recover the liberty of independence of their country. What's that picture of? Well, that's the Stone of Destiny on the coronation chair, which was from the last chapter. Such a leader arose in the person of William Wallace. Actually, I was saying William Wallace. It was Robert the Bruce's Norman descent, along with Balliol. Anyway, let's have a listen to William Wallace then, whose name is still so often mentioned in Scotland. William Wallace was none of the high nobles of Scotland, but the son of a private gentleman called Wallace of Ellerslie in Renfrewshire, near Paisley. He was very tall and handsome, and one of the strongest and bravest men that ever lived. He had a very fine countenance, with a quantity of fair hair, and was particularly dexterous in the use of all weapons which were then employed in battle. Wallace, like all Scotsmen of high spirit, had looked with great indignation upon the usurpation of the crown by Edward, and upon the insolences which the English soldiers committed on his countrymen.
What insolence?
Insults.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
It is said that when he was very young, he went a-fishing for sport in the river of Irvine, near Ayr. He had caught a good many trout, which were carried by a boy who attended him with a fishing basket, as is usual with anglers.
What anglers?
Anglers are fishermen. It's named after the rod that's held at an angle.
Oh.
Anglers. 2 or 3 English soldiers who belonged to the garrison of Ayr came up to Wallace and insisted, with their usual insolence, on taking the fish from the boy. Wallace was contented to allow them a part of the trout, but he refused to part with the whole basketful. The soldiers insisted, and from words came blows, punches, and Wallace had no better weapon than the butt end of his fishing rod, but he struck the foremost of the Englishmen so hard under the ear with it that he killed him on the spot. And getting possession of the slain man's sword, he fought with so much fury that he put the others to flight and brought home his fish safe and sound.
What's flight?
Running away. Well, just going.
All flat for his fish.
The English governor of Ayr sought him to punish him with death for this action, but Wallace lay concealed among the hills and great woods till the matter was forgotten, and then appeared in another part of the country. But the action which occasioned his finally rising in arms is believed to have happened in the town of Lanark. Wallace was at this time married to a lady of that place, and residing there with his wife. It chanced, as he walked in the marketplace, dressed in a green garment, with a rich dagger by his side, that an Englishman came up and insulted him on account of his finery, saying a Scotsman had no business to wear so gay a dress, or carry so handsome a weapon. It soon came to a quarrel, as on many former occasions, and Wallace, having killed the Englishman, fled to his own house, which was speedily assaulted by all the English soldiers. While they were endeavouring to force their way in at the front of the house, Wallace escaped by the back door and got in safety to a rugged and rocky glen near Lanark, called Cartland Crags, all covered with bushes and trees, and full of high precipices, like cliff edges, where he knew he should be safe from the pursuit of the English soldiers. In the meantime, pursuit, when somebody's going after you, chasing you. In the meantime, the governor of Lanark, whose name was Hazelrig, burned Wallace's house and put his wife and servants to death. And by committing this cruelty, increased to the highest pitch, as you may well believe, the hatred with which the champion had always borne against the English usurper. Hazelrig also proclaimed Wallace an outlaw, and offered a reward to anyone who should bring him to an English garrison alive.
What's a garrison?
It's a fort for soldiers. Alive or dead. On the other hand, Wallace soon collected a body of men, outlawed like himself, or willing to become so, rather than any longer endure the oppression of the English. One of his earliest expeditions was directed against Hazelrig, whom he killed, and thus avenged the death of his wife. He fought skirmishes with the soldiers who were sent against him, and often defeated them, and in time became so well known and so formidable, strong, I suppose, that multitudes began to resort to his standard, until at length he was at the head of a considerable army, with which he proposed to restore his country to independence. Wallace's party grew daily stronger and stronger, and many of the Scottish nobles joined with him. Among these were Sir William Douglas, and the head of a great family often mentioned in Scottish history. There was also Sir John the Graham, who became Wallace's bosom friend. Many of these bosom friend, like close to his chest. Many of these great noblemen,
What do you mean close to his chest?
well, like knew what he was thinking, and knew, a really good friend. Many of these great noblemen, however, deserted the cause of the country on the approach of the Earl of Surrey at the head of a numerous and well-appointed army. They thought that Wallace would be unable to withstand the attack of so many disciplined soldiers, and hastened to submit themselves to the English for fear of losing their estates. So in that grand day, a lot of the nobles had ran to the English and said, "We'll support you to fight Wallace," because they knew that if they lost, they'd have the houses and castles taken off them.
Yeah.
Wallace, however, remained undismayed, and at the head of a considerable army.
What's undismayed?
He was not put off by it.
Oh.
He had taken up his camp upon the northern side of the River Forth, near the town of Stirling. The river was there crossed by a long wooden bridge.
Oh, yeah.
The English general approached the banks of the river on the southern side. He sent 2 clergymen to offer a pardon to Wallace and his followers on condition that they should lay down their arms. But such was not
lay down their arms?
The arms are the weapons. But such was not the purpose of the high-minded champion of Scotland. "Go back to Surrey," said Wallace, "and tell him we value not the pardon of the King of England. We are not here for the purpose of treating of peace, but of abiding battle and restoring freedom to our country. Let the English come on. We defy them to their very beards." The English, upon hearing this haughty answer.
What's haughty?
Haughty is like, yes, in a way, it's got like saying, it's bold in a way, I suppose. Called loudly to be led to the attack. Their leader, Sir Richard Lundin, a Scottish knight, so that's a Scottish knight fighting for the English, who had gone over to the enemy at Irvine, hesitated, for he was a skilful soldier, and he saw that to approach the Scottish army, his troops must pass over the long, narrow wooden bridge, so that those who should get over first might be attacked by Wallace with all his forces, before those who remained behind could possibly come to their assistance. He therefore inclined to delay the battle. But Cressingham, the treasurer, who was ignorant and presumptuous, insisted that it was their duty to fight and put an end to the war at once, and Lundin gave way to his opinion. The English army began to cross the bridge, Cressingham leading the van, or foremost division of the army. That took place which London had foreseen. Wallace suffered a considerable part of the English army to pass the bridge, without offering any opposition. But when opposition, without opposing, without stopping them or fighting against them. But when about one half were over and the bridge was crowded with those who were following, he charged those who had crossed with his whole strength, slew a very great number, and drove the rest into the River Forth, where the greater part were drowned. The remainder of the English army, who were left on the southern bank of the river, fled in great confusion, having first set fire to the wooden bridge that the Scots might not pursue them. Cressingham was killed in the very beginning of the battle.
Who's Cressingham?
He was the treasurer of the English army, who said, no, we need to go and get this battle done now. And the Scots detested him so much that they flayed the skin from its dead body and kept pieces of it in memory of the revenge they had taken upon the English treasurer. The remains of Surrey's great army fled out of Scotland after this defeat, and the Scots, taking arms on all sides, attacked the castle in which the English soldiers continued to shelter themselves, and took most of them by force or stratagem, and recovered for a time the complete freedom of the country. Wallace even marched into England and laid Cumberland and Northumberland waste, where the Scottish soldiers, in revenge for the mischief which the English had done in their country, committed great cruelties. He did not approve of their killing the people who were not in arms, and he endeavoured to protect the clergymen and others who were not able to defend themselves. "Remain with me," he said to the priest of Hexham, a large town near Northumberland, "for I cannot protect you from my soldiers when you are out of my presence." The troops who followed Wallace received no pay, because he had no money to give them, and that was one great reason why he could not keep them under restraint or prevent their doing much harm to the defenceless country people. He remained in England for more than 3 weeks and did a great deal of mischief to the country. Indeed, it appears that, though Wallace disapproved of slaying priests, women and children, he partook of the ferocity of the times, so much as to put to death without quarter all whom he found in arms. In the north of Scotland,
So he did what?
he basically killed anybody who had a weapon. He didn't care whether it was a child, a woman, anybody. If they were English, of course. And his soldiers did the same, and his soldiers pillaged.
What's pillage?
Well,
Took the money.
looted people's houses. In the north of Scotland, the English had placed a garrison in the strong castle of Dunnottar, which, built on a large and precipitous rock, overhangs the raging sea. Though the place is almost inaccessible, Wallace and his followers found their way into the castle, while the garrison, in great terror, fled into the church or chapel, which was built on the very verge of the precipice. This did not save them, for Wallace caused the church to be set on fire. The terrified garrison, involved in the flames, ran some of them up the points of the Scottish swords, while others threw themselves from the precipice into the sea and swam along to the cliffs, where they hung like seafowl, screaming in vain for mercy and assistance. The followers of Wallace were frightened at this dreadful scene, and falling on their knees before the priests who chanced to be in the army, they asked forgiveness for having committed so much slaughter within the limits of a church dedicated to the service of God. But Wallace had so deep a sense of the injuries which the English had done to his country, he only laughed at the contrition of his soldiers. "I will absolve you all myself," he said. "You are Scottish.
What does that mean?
I will pardon you for your sins, for killing the priests and killing the people in the church. Are you Scottish soldiers? And do you repent for a trifle like this, which is not half what the invaders deserved at our hands?" Edward I was in Flanders when all these events took place. You may suppose Flanders, no, it's in France. No, is it in France? No, it's not. It's in the Netherlands, isn't it? You may suppose he was very angry when he learned that Scotland, which he thought completely subdued, had risen into a great insurrection against him, defeated his armies, killed his treasurer, chased his soldiers out of their country, and invaded England with a great force. He came back from Flanders in a mighty rage, and determined not to leave that rebellious country until it was finally conquered, for which purpose he assembled a very fine army and marched into Scotland. In the meantime, the Scots prepared to defend themselves and chose Wallace to be the governor of the kingdom, because they had no king at the time. He was now titled Sir William Wallace, Protector or Governor of the Scottish nation. But although Wallace, as we have seen, was the best soldier and bravest man in Scotland, and therefore the most fit to be placed in command at this critical period, yet the nobles of Scotland envied him this important situation because he was not a man born in high rank or enjoying a large estate. So great was their jealousy of Sir William Wallace that many of these great barons did not seem very willing to bring forward their forces or fight against the English, because they would not have a man of inferior condition to be their general. This was base and mean conduct, and it was attended with great disasters to Scotland. Yet, notwithstanding this unwillingness of the great nobility to support him, Wallace assembled a large army, for the middling, but especially the lower classes, were very much attached to him. He marched boldly against the King of England and met him near the town of Falkirk. Most of the Scottish armies were on foot, because in those days only the nobility fought on horseback. The English king, the nobility, the nobles, the people who, the princes and the kings and the dukes and those who have large estates. The English king, on the contrary, had a very large body of the finest cavalry in the world, Normans and English, all clothed in complete armour. He had also the celebrated archers of England, each of whom was said to carry 12 Scotsmen's lives under his girdle, because every archer had 12 arrows stuck in his belt. The Scots had some good archers from the forest of Ettrick, who fought under the command of Sir John Stuart, but they were not nearly equal in number to the English. The greater part of the Scottish army were on foot. Armed with long spears, they were placed thick and close together, and laid all their spears so close, point over point, that it seemed as difficult to break through them as through the wall of a strong castle. When the two armies were drawn up facing each other, Wallace said to his soldiers, "I have brought you to the ring. Let me see how you can dance," meaning, I brought you to the decisive field of battle. Let me see how bravely you can fight. The English made the attack. King Edward, though he saw the close ranks and undaunted appearance of the Scottish infantry, resolved nevertheless to try whether he could not ride them down with his fine cavalry. He therefore gave his horsemen orders to advance. They charged accordingly at full gallop. It must have been a terrible thing to have seen these fine horses riding as hard as they could against the long lances, which were held out by the Scots to keep them back, and a dreadful cry arose when they came against each other. The first line of cavalry was commanded by the Earl Marshal of England, whose progress was checked by a morass. The second line of English horse was commanded by the Bishop of Durham, who wore armour and fought like a lay baron. I'm not sure, Rachel. He wheeled round the morass, but when he saw the deep and firm order of the Scots, his heart failed, and he proposed to Sir Ralph Basset, who commanded under him, to halt till Edward himself brought up the reserve. "Go say your mass, Bishop," answered Basset contemptuously, and abandon at full gallop with the second line. However, the Scots stood their ground with their long spears. Many of the foremost of the English horses were thrown down, and the riders were killed as they lay rolling, unable to rise owing to the weight of their heavy armour. But the Scottish horse did not come to the assistance of their infantry, but on the contrary fled away from the battle. It is supposed that this was owing to the treachery or ill will of the nobility, who were jealous of Wallace. But it must be considered that the Scottish cavalry were few in number, and that they had much worse arms and weaker horses than their enemies. The English cavalry attempted again and again to disperse the deep and solid ranks in which Wallace had stationed his foot soldiers, but they were repeatedly beaten off with loss, nor could they make their way through that wood of spears, as it is called by one of the English historians. Edward then commanded his archers to advance, and these, approaching within arrow shot of the Scottish ranks, poured on them such close and dreadful volleys of arrows that it was impossible to sustain the discharge. It happened at the same time that Sir John Stuart was killed by a fall from his horse, and the archers of Ettrick Forest, whom he was bringing forward to oppose those of King Edward, were slain in great number around him. Their bodies were afterwards distinguished among the slain as being the tallest and handsomest men of the army. The Scottish spearmen, being thus thrown into some degree of confusion by the loss of those who were slain by the arrows of the English, the heavy cavalry of Edward again charged with more success than formerly and broke through the ranks, which were already disordered. Sir John Graham, Wallace's great friend and companion, was slain, with many other brave soldiers, and the Scots, having lost a very great number of men, were at length obliged to take flight. The fatal battle was fought upon the 22nd of July, 1298. After this fatal defeat of Falkirk, the English. After this fatal defeat at Falkirk, Sir William Wallace seems to have resigned his office of Governor of Scotland. Several nobles were named guardians in his place and continued to make resistance to the English armies. Nevertheless, the King of England possessed so much wealth and so many means of raising soldiers that he sent army after army into the poor oppressed country of Scotland, and obliged all its nobles and great men, one after another, to submit themselves once more to his yoke. Sir William Wallace, with a very small band of followers, refused either to acknowledge the usurper Edward or to lay down his arms. He continued to maintain himself among the woods and mountains of his native country for no less than 7 years after his defeat at Falkirk, and for more than 1 year after all the other defenders of Scottish liberty had laid down their arms. Many proclamations were sent out against him by the English, and a great reward was set upon his head, for Edward did not think he could have any secure possession of his usurped kingdom of Scotland while Wallace lived. At length he was taken prisoner, and, shame it is to say, a Scotsman called Sir John Menteith was the person by whom he was seized and delivered to the English. The tradition of the country is that the signal made for rushing upon him and taking him at unawares was when one of his pretended friends who betrayed him should turn a loaf which was placed on the table with its bottom or flat side uppermost. And in after times it was reckoned ill-breeding to turn a loaf in that manner. If there was a person named Menteith in company, since it was as much as to remind him that his namesake had betrayed Sir William Wallace, the champion of Scotland. Edward, having thus obtained possession of the person who he considered as the greatest obstacle to his complete conquest of Scotland, resolved to make Wallace an example to all Scottish patriots who should in future venture to oppose his ambitious projects. He caused this gallant defender of his country to be brought to trial in Westminster Hall before the English judges, and produced him there, crowned in mockery with a green garland, because he said he had been king of outlaws and robbers among the Scottish woods. Wallace was accused of having been a traitor to the English crown, to which he answered, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." He was then charged with having taken and burnt towns and castles, with having killed many men and done much violence. He replied with the same calm resolution that it was true he had killed very many Englishmen, but it was because they had come to subdue and oppress his native country of Scotland. And far from repeating what he had done, he declared he was only sorry that he had not put to death more of them. Notwithstanding that Wallace's defence was a good one, for surely everyone has not only a right to fight in defence of his native country, but is bound in duty to do so, the English judges condemned him to be executed. So this brave patriot was dragged upon a sledge to the place of execution, where his head was struck off and his body divided into 4 quarters, which, according to the cruel custom of the times, were exposed upon spikes of iron on London Bridge. No doubt King Edward thought that by exercising this great severity towards so distinguished a patriot, he should terrify all the Scots into obedience. But Sir William Wallace, that immortal supporter of the independence of his country, was no sooner deprived of his life in that cruel and unjust manner than other patriots arose to assert the cause of Scottish liberty. And who would that next patriot be?
William Morris.